I never sought attention in the neighborhood. For years, my lakefront home sat quietly at the water's edge, a place I designed, built, and shaped into exactly what I wanted. Private, peaceful, and entirely mine. The dock stretched out over still water. The mornings were unhurried. I paid my HOA dues on time, kept the property immaculate, and had no interest whatsoever in the politics that seemed to consume so much energy in communities like ours. That changed the afternoon. I opened my mailbox and found a formal notice informing me that I owed several years of unpaid HOA fees. The number was substantial. The claim was false. I knew it immediately, not from memory or assumption, but because I'm the kind of person who keeps records. That evening I opened my files and confirmed what I already knew. Every payment, documented with receipts, bank confirmations, and dates. Not a single gap. Not a single discrepancy. I was so certain of the error that I scheduled a meeting with the HOA office the following week, expecting a brief, professional correction. What I got instead was a wall. The HOA president, a woman with a well-earned reputation in the neighborhood for manufacturing crises where none existed, glanced at my documentation and dismissed it. Her files, she insisted, told a different story. My files, organized and verified, apparently carried less weight than her conviction. Further notices arrived in the weeks that followed, each more severe in tone than the last. A billing dispute had transformed, through bureaucratic momentum and apparent personal determination, into a formal enforcement action. My attorney reviewed everything and reached the same conclusion I had. Something was deeply wrong, and it wasn't my records. We began preparing a legal response, methodical and thorough, fully expecting the matter to reach a rational resolution through proper channels. What none of us anticipated was what happened on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning, when construction vehicles appeared at the edge of my property. I watched from the window, then from the lawn, then from a few feet away as work crews, operating under authorization that had moved with stunning speed to the HOA's enforcement process, began removing portions of my lakefront home. Walls that had taken months to build came down in hours. A structure layered with years of decisions, investments, and personal history was being dismantled while the neighborhood watched. Most people expected an emotional reaction. What they got instead was silence, and a legal team that immediately shifted gears. Because here's what the HOA president did not know, and what my attorneys were about to spend several weeks making perfectly clear. The dispute over unpaid fees was the smallest thread in a much larger tapestry. Years before this neighborhood had taken its current shape, I had been acquiring land, quietly, methodically, without announcement. Parcels surrounding the lake had come to me through a series of investments that unfolded over time, connected through holding entities and recorded in the county with the same meticulous attention I gave to every financial decision. I had never concealed any of it. It was all in the public record, available to anyone who cared to look. The HOA leadership, it turned out, had never looked. My legal team assembled the documentation over several weeks. Property maps, historical development agreements, infrastructure records, access easements, and ownership chains that stretch back to the neighborhood's founding. Each document was cross-referenced and verified by independent experts retained specifically to ensure nothing could be questioned. What emerged from that process was a portrait of the community's legal foundation that most of its current residents, and apparently its entire board, had never seen. The formal meeting was held in a conference room overlooking the lake, which felt appropriate. Attorneys, independent consultants, HOA board members, and various representatives filled the space. Large format maps covered the screens. Historical timelines traced the neighborhood's development from its earliest agreements to the present day. The presentation began simply, with a clear overview of property ownership in the immediate area. Then it expanded outward layer by layer. Development agreements that linked adjacent parcels. Shared infrastructure. The marina access road. The community boat launch. The common utility corridors. And the agreements that had originally established who held rights over each. Historical planning documents revealed relationships between community assets and private holdings that predated the HOA's current charter by years. Board members who had walked into a room with the confident posture of people who believed they held the upper hand were, by the midpoint of the presentation, studying documents with an entirely different expression. The defining moment came near the end. long before the HOA had existed in its present form. Several foundational agreements governing key community assets had been established through entities connected directly to my investment company. These weren't obscure technicalities buried in fine print. They were primary agreements, properly executed, publicly recorded, and continuously valid. They hadn't expired. They hadn't been superseded. They had simply never been reviewed by the people who most needed to understand them. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when a large and complicated situation suddenly becomes simple. To their credit, several board members responded not with defensiveness, but with a genuine pivot toward resolution. The conversation shifted from dispute to accountability, and from accountability to a practical path forward. No one in that room, not the attorneys, not the consultants, not the board members who were processing a significant amount of new information, had any interest in prolonging a conflict whose outcome the documents had already determined. Negotiations over the following weeks were professional and focused. Damages were assessed by independent experts. Compensation frameworks were established. Agreements were restructured to reflect the verified reality of who owned what and under what terms. The woman who had set this entire sequence in motion stepped away from her position on the board. No dramatic announcement. No public confrontation. She simply was no longer there. And then, with the legal foundation properly rebuilt, attention turned to the literal foundation. Architects brought plans. Engineers consulted with designers. What rose from the cleared site along the water was not simply a replacement for what had been lost. It was better, designed with the benefit of experience and built with materials and craftsmanship that reflected everything learned from the previous home and everything that had unfolded since. When the project was complete, and I stood on the finished terrace watching the lake catch the last light of an autumn afternoon, the view was as good as it had ever been. Better, perhaps, for what it had cost to see it clearly. The neighborhood came out of the experience changed in ways that mattered. The board adopted mandatory records review for any enforcement action above a defined threshold. Residents who had never thought twice about the legal infrastructure underlying their community began asking questions and attending meetings. Transparency replaced assumption as the operating standard, not because anyone mandated it, but because the cost of the alternative had become impossible to ignore. What I took from it was simpler. I had not won because I was loud, connected, or willing to escalate beyond what was warranted. I had won because 20 years of careful record-keeping and patient investment had built a position that required nothing more than a clear presentation of facts. The truth needed no argument. It only needed the right moment and the right room. When that moment came, the document spoke, and every person in that conference room listened,